We all make promises every day. But what's the real difference between a casual promise and one that could actually land you in court? Well, it turns out there's this hidden rule in law that connects something as simple as a family promise to a massive national strike. So let's dig in and figure it out.
All right, so let's just get right to it. Is every single promise you make a contract? Like if you tell your friend, hey, I'll grab you a coffee tomorrow, and then you totally forget, could they actually sue you? Probably not. But the reason they can is where all the interesting legal stuff really begins.
Yeah. See, the whole thing hinges on what makes a promise enforceable. It's not just about what you say. It's about what you and the other person actually meant when you said it. And of course, the law has a very specific formal name for this whole idea. And here it is. This is the secret sauce, the magic ingredient. It's called intention to create legal relations. It sounds super formal, I know, but all it really means is that for a promise to be a real contract, both of you had to be thinking, yep, this is serious, this is legally binding. If that intention isn't there, then a promise is just, well, it's just words. Okay, but that brings up a pretty good question, right? How on earth is a judge supposed to know what you were thinking? They're not mind readers. So what the law does is actually pretty clever. It uses these things called presumptions. You can think of them like the default settings on your phone or computer. The law just has a default assumption about your intention, and that setting changes depending on the situation.
And to really see how this works in practice, we just need to look at two totally different worlds, each with its own default setting: your personal life and your business life.
So check this out. It's like a simple switch. For social and family stuff, promises to your partner, your kids, your friends, the default setting is off. The law just assumes you're not trying to create a legal contract. Let's be honest, the courts have better things to do than get involved in family arguments. But when you step into the world of business, that switch gets flipped to on. The starting assumption there is that every agreement is meant to be a serious, legally binding contract. It has to be that way to keep business running smoothly.
There's a really famous old case that perfectly illustrates this default offsetting. It's called Balfour v. Balfour. So a husband was working overseas and promised to send his wife a monthly allowance. Well, he stopped paying, so she took him to court. But the court basically said, nope, not our problem. They decided it was just a normal domestic arrangement made between a husband and wife, not a legally binding contract. The intention just wasn't there.
Okay, so what about the other way around? Can you be in a business setting and flip that on switch back to off? Absolutely. Take this case with a bank and a company. The company gave the bank something called a letter of comfort. In it, they said it was their policy to make sure their smaller company could pay its loans. Well, the smaller company went bust, and the bank came knocking, saying, hey, you guaranteed this. But the court disagreed. That one word, policy, was the key. It meant it was just a statement of what they were doing at the time, not a rock-solid promise for the future. It just goes to show, even in business, your exact words matter a lot. All right, so we've seen this rule work for one-on-one promises. Now let's blow this up to a massive scale. Let's talk about agreements that affect millions and millions of people. I'm talking about the huge deals negotiated by trade unions. This is where our little hidden rule about intention gets really, really tested. And I'm not kidding about the scale. Just to put it in perspective, back in 2022, there were more than 6.5 million union members in the UK. That is a huge number of people. We're talking about massive organizations cutting deals that can literally shape the entire economy. So these unions go and negotiate what are called collective agreements. These things cover everything: pay, hours, safety conditions for all those millions of workers. You'd think, with so much on the line, these agreements have got to be legally binding contracts, right? I mean, it seems like a no-brainer. Well, get ready for the twist. In UK law, the default setting for these gigantic economy-shaping agreements is off. You heard that right. The law actually presumes they are not legally binding contracts, unless both sides put it in writing and say, hey, we want this one to be enforceable in court. It's a very deliberate decision. The idea is to keep these negotiations out of the courts and give both sides more flexibility. But it all comes back to that one key idea: intention. So just think about what that means for a second. If an employer goes back on one of these collective agreements and it's not a legally binding contract, what can the union do? They can't just sue them for breach of contract. This completely changes the power dynamic. It means that the final, most powerful tool they have isn't a lawyer. It's a strike. And that's exactly what we're going to look at now. What happens when these agreements, which some people call binding in honor only, what happens when that honor breaks down? When promises aren't kept, you enter a whole different world with a completely different set of rules.
And this has a massive, real-world impact. It's not just theory. Just look at 2022. In that 1 year, over 2.5 million working days were lost because of strikes in the UK. That's the highest number since way back in 1989. So yeah, this stuff has huge consequences for the economy and for everyone's daily lives.
Now, you can't just decide to go on strike. It's actually a really complicated legal process. To be protected by the law, the union has to jump through a bunch of hoops. First, the strike has to be about a real trade dispute, like pay or jobs. You can't just strike for political reasons. Second, they have to hold a formal postal ballot, and a lot of people have to actually vote. And finally, they have to give the employer at least 14 days' notice. It's a very, very structured process.
And there's some really important context here, too. The power to organize a strike really depends on how many members you have. And that's where things have been changing. Union membership has fallen off a cliff in the private sector over the last few decades. But in the public sector, think teachers, nurses, civil servants, it stayed pretty strong. And that really explains why so many of the strikes you hear about these days are happening in the public sector.
So, there you have it. We've gone all the way from a simple promise between two people to a national picket line with thousands of workers. And the whole thing, the entire journey, hangs on that one hidden legal idea, the intention to be legally bound. It really makes you think, doesn't it? In a world filled with all kinds of promises, from the tiny to the massive, where do you think the law should draw that line?